Good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you're at. Today we'll be having, it's hard to remember what to call her, but Carmella Javellana-Hirano doing the talk today on fear and anxiety in the age of Mappo. Some of you know she's also my wife, but we have supposedly 100 and Yumi sent me this information. We have 115 people registered, which I thought was pretty good. And we have 44 temples from various different areas, from BCA, Hawaii, South America, the United Kingdom, and Higashi Honganji temples. We have 15 ministers' assistants and 16 ministers. So I'm very happy that you're all joining us, because CBE, as you know, we can't have the live seminars during this time at the JSC, so we have switched to have all these seminars virtually. So it seems very good that we're going to be doing it through this Zoom platform, because we've been having quite a few participating. So to just get started, we'll first begin with Gasho. Namo Amida Butsu. Thank you. I don't know if we sent out a thing on Carmella, but I'll just introduce her a little bit. As I said, she's my wife. She's also a MD. She's a psychiatrist. She's also my minister's assistant. She's from a very Catholic family. Her older brother was a Catholic priest, her older sister a nun. So making the jump to Buddhism was something for her. She has her, she went to Ohio State to get her residency, and she's been here in the United States for more than the years she probably wants me to tell all of you. But she was first a Zen Buddhist after leaving Catholicism. She lived at the Salt Lake Zen Center, and then when we met, she moved to become Jodo Shinshu. She graduated with a Shin certificate from IBS, and I think she's thinking of going on to get a regular master's degree through IBS. Right now she has a clinical private practice, and she works with all age groups. And she has done this fear and anxiety in a different version for our temple, because both of us do these study classes every week. So if you have any questions, I'm sure you can email her, or she'll have some time after to take questions. She has attendance and a lot, so we might not get to the questions and answers. So I'll turn the time over to her. So I will mute and turn off my.
Thanks, honey. Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I've prepared some slides for you, and I've also sent my notes to Judy last night, so I hope you got it. There's a lot of stuff to wade through there, but I'd like to just kind of go through most of this material pretty fast, and then go more into how the first aspect of the mind, as understood from the concept of Buddhist cosmology, philosophy, and psychology, can be translated directly into the current predicaments that we are in. So I'll start with my slide change here. Okay, so let's just get to it. When I was doing this research on this material, this is basically what happened to my brain. It just kind of exploded, especially because Buddhist cosmology and philosophy are just such a vast area to go into. There's basically a fathomless ocean once you get in there, and sometimes I have to remind my patients to try to just come back to this normal existence that we have, no matter how miserable it is, and try to glean as much as we could from the teachings of the masters. And of course, in our tradition, it goes all the way back to Shakyamuni. So I'd like to just kind of go through the first part. And if you look in your handout, it's how the mind is viewed from Buddhist cosmology, philosophy, and psychology. And the reason I want to get right into the mind is that ultimately it's the mind that pretty much creates everything and distorts everything. But the second part of it, I'd like to be kind of more interactive. So when we get to the Q&A section, hopefully that would be after an hour. Maybe we could take a break in between. I'd like for people to maybe start thinking about what questions they might have that they could share with the group, so we can all discuss what this issue is with fear and anxiety in this age of Mappo. Okay, so let's get to the heart of the nitty-gritty metaphysical, mental, Buddhist approach to how to understand the mind. Just a little bit of historical background, because we need to put Mappo, I guess, in a temporal context in order to understand how we got here, how this pickle that we find ourselves in actually has underpinnings with what happened in the past, of course, with dependent arising. So in Buddhist cosmology, we could look first at the Buddha's death around 483, which is where the whole thing started, this whole movement of making sure that the Buddha's teachings do not go extinct, if you will. And so this is where the Buddhist councils were organized. The first one was 3 months after the Buddha's death. And I guess I would imagine at the time they were all freaking out, because now the Buddha's dead. No more, what are we going to do? And so they organized his teachings based on verbatim memory. And of course, we know Ananda, the Buddha's cousin and personal attendant, might have been on the spectrum, the autism spectrum, with this incredible memory, and he recited the sutras. Thus, I have heard. And Upali probably had his own version of Asperger, was able to recite the Vinaya. So these people had incredible memory stores. The second Buddhist council was about 100 years after the Buddha's death. And this was when they started looking at the teachings themselves, and two views emerged. The Mahasamgikas were the traditionalist or conservative group, and the Staviras, or the liberal group, wanted to change. And this is kind of not so much different from the world that we live in now, where everybody has opinions from the conservative to the liberal end of the spectrum. However, the traditionalists won this one out. The third Buddhist council was 200 years after the Buddha's death. And the center of this event was King Ashoka, who was considered to be the greatest benefactor of Buddhism. And what happened was he sent these monks with knowledge of the Dharma and the Vinaya to 9 different countries, and that's when Buddhism began to spread. The Buddhist canon itself emerged from
PowerPoint just on the one screen. Do you need to change the PowerPoint?
No.
Oh, okay. People would ask me.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if you got your handouts, but you can take your handouts and just kind of follow along if you could. Yeah, this is the only screen I have for the Buddhist universe in the traditional group. But anyway, from the third Buddhist council, the Tripitaka, the 3 baskets of the Buddhist canon emerged. And we know the Vinaya Pitaka, the book of discipline for the monastic Sangha. And the second basket was the Sutta Pitaka, the Buddha's discourses during his 45-year teaching career. And then the jewel of the 3 baskets is the Amidhamma Pitaka, And it's considered to be the crown jewel of the Buddha's teachings because some writers have said it's the most perfect expression possible of the Buddha's philosophy, psychology, and universal compassionate ethic to save all beings from dukkha. So all phenomena in the Buddhist cosmos are basically macroscopic proportions of the mind itself. In the fourth Buddhist council, about the 1st century BCE, was when the, BCE, was when the Tripitaka was first written on palm leaves, hence the word sutras, because the leaves were connected together by threads or sutures. And then the Abhidhamma Pitaka underwent further development and systematized basically the Buddha's teachings. So if we look at the word Abhidhamma, Abhi means higher or transcending, and Dharma, of course, or Dhamma are principles or phenomena. And therefore the Abhidhamma Pitaka literally means the principles that transcend human comprehension. Abhi is also about Dharma teaching, translating as teaching, or even meta teaching. And so the Theravadins and Vastavadins, Abhidharmikas, consider the Abhidharma to be the pure and literal description of ultimate truth and expression of the Buddha's unsullied wisdom. So whereas the sutras are considered conventional and figurative, given to the Buddha, by the Buddha to specific groups of people, the Abhidharma Pitaka basically is a more refined and meticulous system of cataloging and documenting all of the Buddha's teachings. And you can find all of this in this book, the Abhidhamma, by the Abhidhammata Sangaha in this book, which is, you know, I have to be medicated to actually read all this stuff. And I admit I haven't read all of it. It's hard to get through. By Bhikkhu Bodhi. The name of the book is The Comprehensive Manual of the Abhidhamma, which is the English translation from the Pali Canon, because the Chinese and the Tibetan canons have not been translated to English yet. Okay, so we go on to Buddhist cosmology, and on your screen you can see basically a picture of what the Buddhist physical cosmos might look like.
So Reverend Hirano, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yes, sorry.
I think a lot of people, if you're changing slides, I think a lot of people aren't able to see the slides. Does it still say paused on your viewing screen? Your slide?
Oh yeah, it does, huh?
Yeah. So hit unpause.
Oh, how do I do that? So your screen sharing is paused. Resume share.
There you go.
Okay. Oh, good. This is just the third slide, so don't worry. The first one didn't even matter. Okay. So anyway, we're looking at the Buddhist cosmos as conceptualized by the more traditional groups, the Abhidharmikas. And this was in keeping with how the two streams of Buddhism essentially started to become more defined as time went on. In this picture, we see basically the heart of the physical space called Mount Sumeru. And in your handout, there's like a ton of descriptions about what that would look like. But basically, the cosmological structure of Abhidharma, the Abhidharma people, the Theravadins and the Sarvastivadins, the traditional group, and then the Mahayana group are a little bit different. And the main difference between these two groups of people basically are delineated in three different aspects. Okay, the traditional or the Abhidharma group focus on the prominence of Mount Sumeru, which is what you see, which is the center of the universe. And in Mahayana, they focus more on Buddha realms or Buddha lands. And then the traditional ones focus more on dharmas or basic teachings or basic elements of existence versus Buddhas. And then in the traditional view, Shakyamuni was the historical central figure. And then in Mahayana, he expanded into more of a superhuman cosmological universal principle that we are now perhaps more familiar with. So the Abhidharma cosmology and psychology has two aspects. There's the temporal and then there's the spatial. And this is where Mappo probably comes in that sense. And that is the universe has its own lifespan with 4 phases. There is divided into aeons or kalpas. So there's 4 phases or stages in the universe's lifespan. It's the stage of world contraction, where it's destroyed by fire, water, or air, and then it becomes empty. And we have to be careful about the word empty, because in Buddhism, emptiness is not necessarily just emptiness, the void, but it's somethingness. And we will talk more about that hopefully later. And then from this nothingness came the world of the aeon of world expansion, where the universe becomes repopulated again by sentient beings. And then there's the aeon of world existence, which is basically where we're at. So these aeons are measured in units of time called kalpa. And a kalpa is really hard to, we've heard about kalpas in our sensei's Dharma talks and our study groups, hopefully, but one way to define kalpa is what the Buddha said. He taught in similes, which makes things a little bit understandable. He said, suppose there were a great stone mountain, a yojana across. A yojana is a measure of distance or space. A yojana broad, a yojana high, without holes or fissures, a solid mass. And suppose that every 100 years a man would stroke it just once with a very fine piece of cloth. That rock would be worn away completely before the end of a kalpa. So that's how long a kalpa is. Ayojana, which is the spatial aspect of the ancient Buddhist cosmology, is not to be confused with the geographical or physical structure of the earth. So we have to really look at this more from a representational, perhaps metaphysical aspect. There is a sutra called Kevada, where a layman named Kevada asked a monk where the 4 elements of earth when fire and water cease completely. So he asked everybody around, from masters of meditations to the gods of the 4 kings, and the higher gods of the 33. I mean, these are all like cosmological language, right? The Yama gods, the contented gods, the gods who delight in creation, the masters of the creations of others, the gods of Brahma. But none of them could answer his question. So finally he asked the Buddha. And the Buddha answered, the 4 elements, earth, water, wind, and fire, cease completely in the consciousness that knows nirvana. And to me, this is a little interesting in the sense that I kind of related to some of the other stuff that I've been reading in the past. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, these 4 elements are described in detail in the process of dying. And in fact, this Jack Cornfield, who's a forest monk, psychologist, has written a simple guided meditation on the process of dying, cultivating awareness of the gradual cessation of these 4 elements. But from a more useful perspective, nirvana, of course, is the cessation of suffering. And so when consciousness dissipates and ceases, then nirvana begins. The traditional Buddhist cosmological structure is called a world system or Chakravada. There are 4 cardinal directions outside of this mountain. In the south is Jambudvipa, or the continent of the rose apple tree, which is supposed to be where human beings live. And the southern tip, below the towering abode of snows, or Himalaya, is effectively India. So we have to remember that this early cosmological structure also has very heavy Hindu influences. But India is supposedly where the Buddhas arise, or the Himalaya. And in the spaces between the world spheres and below are various hells. And in the shadow of the slopes of Mount Sumeru dwell the jealous gods called Asuras, and we'll talk more about that in the next few slides. Expelled from the heaven of the 33 by its king Chakra. On the slopes of Mount Sumeru are 6 realms inhabited by the gods of the sense spheres, and we will see that in the subsequent slide on the Wheel of Samsara, or the Bhava Chakra. But anyway, there's all this detailed descriptions of what that is. But basically, the significance of this is that while the Brahmas in the higher realms of the form sphere are said to rule over 100,000, and those beings born in the lower spheres come from their karmic baggage, so to speak, the whole idea about this is the Buddha was trying to teach how we are all burdened by this karma, but there is a way to transcend all of the suffering that we know exists in this world of Jambudvipa. So nirvana may be attained in any of these realms that we see, from the human realm to the highest of the pure abodes, or the Brahma Viharas, right? You've heard of the Brahma Viharas. It's a loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity, and the 4 formless realms. So now there is a cyclical nature to this particular realm of existence. So the beings here experience unhappiness, then unhappiness, and then this is essentially the nature of samsara itself that we will see in the wheel a little bit later. And then there's realms, the 31 realms of existence. We're not going to worry about that, but I would like to just kind of show you. Oops, what happened? Oh, okay, so it's probably in your handout. But basically the 31 realms are thought to be important in the hierarchical codification of the human mind itself. And that the 32nd realm connotes completion and fulfillment of existence itself. But anyway, the significance of Buddhist cosmology is basically to seek some answers into our existential crisis about why we're here and what is our purpose and why is this happening to me. All of this information is really meant to help explain to us the source of our suffering and how we can get out of suffering. And so in the conclusion of this section, the Buddha basically says that the end of the world, where one is not born, does not age, does not die, does not pass away, does not reappear, is to be known, seen or reached by traveling, that I do not say. And yet I do not say that one makes an end to suffering without reaching the end of the world. Rather, in this fathom-long body with its perceptions and mind, I declare the world, the arising of the world, the ceasing of the world, and the way leading to the ceasing of the world. And this is from Samyutta Nikaya, which is one of the older doctrinal sutras, basically, that the Buddha is basically saying that the existence of human suffering is pretty much the same as what the entire universe, the entire cosmos would be experiencing. And then I think in your handout, you're going to see some pictures about these various levels of existence. There's one that looks like a tower, you know, which talks about the 8 hot hells. And And of course, the worst hell of all is Avicii. And Shinran, I think, talks about that in the collected works. And then there's another handout here. I don't know if you got it, but it just kind of shows you these 33, the 31 levels of existence. And the detailed plan of the dwellings of the 33 gods. I mean, it's all really kind of esoteric stuff. We'll just skip all that, okay? And then let's just go right to the Wheel of Samsara. So the Wheel of Samsara is more Mahayanic in its origin, from what I understand, and it's essentially a Tibetan tanka. And you may have seen, you know, the tanka on the left, which shows the god Yama holding the wheel of life in its jaws, and at the very center are three animals: the rooster, the snake, and a pig, which symbolize our klesha or bonno, greed, anger, ignorance. But what happens is that the center of this wheel with the three animals is basically what drives all these different rotations and mood swings that we know now in our present life. And so even though this Wheel of Samsara is a cosmological representation of the universe itself, it's also a microcosm of the human mind. So it's, I think, important to understand from a Buddhist psychological perspective that the acts of the mouth and the body, so now we're talking karma, the acts of the mouth and body are driven by intentionality or will, which can either be wholesome or unwholesome. And so the Abhidharma basically talks about a catalog of wholesome and unwholesome mind states, depending on, and these wholesomeness or unwholesomeness of the mind depends on intention. So intention here is really important as a way maybe of understanding a little bit later this idea of bodhicitta, you know, the mind that aspires for salvation. So at the same time that karma can exist as a simple act of will, a forceful mental intention or volition, it does not necessarily lead to an act of body and speech, but there is still mental karma there, if you will. There are 10 courses of unwholesome action that are generated by the three animals in the middle, by klesha. There's 3 bodily actions of killing, stealing, sexual misconduct. There's 4 vocal actions of lying, divisive speech, hurtful speech, frivolous speech, and 3 mental actions of covetousness, ill will, and wrong view. And again, these actions are based on intentionality. To me, what's interesting about this is that when we watch the news and look at all the politics and all the phenomena in the world, you know, that tell us about COVID-19 and prior to COVID-19, gun violence and all of that, to me, it's interesting how these karmic acts are basically unfolding right before my very eyes, just like exactly how the ancient masters talked about them. So here's the thing about intentionality, which is really important in terms maybe of touching on Buddhist ethics. There's an intentionality, for example, in killing. So intentionality makes all the difference, I guess. Well, some difference. But anyway, in killing, for example, there's 5 conditions that have to be filled in this intentionality. 1, there must be a living creature. Number 2, one must know the creature is alive. 1 must intend to kill the creature. 1 must perform the action necessary to kill the creature. And the creature must actually die. So there are conditions that are required in order to come to this incredible karmic burden. So a lot of the scholars basically say karma is not determinism, meaning that it depends on our responses to experience. So there's another key: responding to what is presented in front of us. New actions in time bear their own fruit in the future. So anything new that we do now can have outcomes in the future, and this is based on dependent arising, of course. So from the Buddhist perspective, there are certain experiences in life that are indeed the results of previous actions, and this is kind of how we got in this pickle. But our karma can take on a different course depending upon the choices or intentions that we make. And I think this is really important, especially now in this environment of catastrophizing. And that is that we can always come back to the intentionality of how we can live our lives now so that they can make a difference in the future. So according to Rupert Gethin, his book, The Foundations of Buddhism, he said the language of Buddhist cosmology is not the language of modern physics. If we wish to understand it, the Buddhist tradition itself suggests that we should look no further than our own minds. For in many respects, the workings of the vast cosmos are nothing other than the workings of our mind writ large. And so this is kind of where this whole idea about looking at Buddhist cosmology comes from, is really just looking at our own minds in a very expansive and incomprehensible way, really. Okay, so let's get to Mahayana cosmology. So we know that the Mahayana movement came from the realization of the superiority of the Buddha's awakening to that of his disciples. And this is not a denigration of the Theravada tradition, but it's really just another way of understanding the Buddha's teachings and living a Buddhist way of life. The path followed by the Buddha is thus Maha, or great, and Yana is vehicle. And so the Bodhisattva Yana, or the vehicle of the Bodhisattva, ending in the perfect awakening of the fully awakened Samyak Sambuddha, as opposed to the vehicle of the disciple, Shravakayana, which is formerly pejoratively mistaken as Hinayana, or inferior vehicle. So we need to be very careful that, you know, there are people who are so much better with the way of the Shravaka, of the follower, the disciple. And then you have, of course, the Bodhisattvas that we are in the midst of living with today. The earliest Mahayana texts came in the late 2nd century CE when they were translated into Chinese by Lokak Shema. Some scholars have traced these sutras to the Mahasamgikas. It was important to note that this is not a sectarian schism. Mahayana teachings were esoteric teachings, actually, to a small group of monks from different ancient schools. There are very important Mahayana sutras that are now frequent references, really, if we want to study more of this stuff. You have the Bodhisattva Pitaka, the Dasabhumika Sutra, which talks about the stages of the Bodhisattva path, Prajna Paramita Sutras, or the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and so on. Anyway, the Pure Land Sutras are also part of these really important Mahayanic sutras, especially the larger and smaller Sukhavati-Vyuha Sutras and the Meditation Sutras. It's a very long name for it. Pratyutpana Buddha, Samukhavashti Samadhi Sutra. Okay, but anyway, the reason I point this out is because ultimately in Jodo Shinshu, we rely on these 3 doctrinal teachings for our school: the larger sutra, smaller sutra, and the contemplation sutra. And these sutras basically talk about how bodhisattvas become Buddhas. And one of these is the ascetic Sumedha, or Mega. And he met a previous Buddha named Dipamkara, who he could have chosen as his teacher and could have become an arhat in that life. So if he had have done so, then there would be no Gautama Buddha, only the arhat Sumedha, But because of the Mahayana way, Sumedha Bodhisattva became Gautama Buddha because of the Mahayana. He chose to practice the perfections of paramitas, and eventually, many, many, many kalpas later, became the fully awakened one. So this is the differentiation between the career of the disciple versus the career of the bodhisattva. So if we all want to be Buddhas, then we have to be bodhisattvas. But of course, as we will learn later, Jodo Shinshu Buddhists are not bodhisattvas. Jodo Shinshu Buddhists are bamboo. All right. So there are 4 bodhisattva vows. If to become a Buddha, bodhisattvas have to fulfill incredible and perfect incredible practices, the 6 paramitas and bodhisattva vows. The bodhisattva vows basically state, beings are numberless, I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha's way is unsurpassable, I vow to become it. So I remember when I was practicing Zen, we would say these bodhisattva vows in our formal services. But then when I studied Jodo Shinshu, became Jodo Shinshu Buddhist, I look at these bodhisattva vows and I'm thinking, what are they talking about? I mean, I could barely get out of bed some days and then try to fulfill these bodhisattva vows. So of course, you know, from my perspective, these are just impossible. So we think about another bodhisattva who became a Buddha, and that is the bodhisattva Dharmakara, who fulfilled 48 vows and became Amida Buddha. And so in the Mahayana tradition, you know, the Pure Land Sutras fall right into this way of thinking. So the Mahayana essentially emphasizes the unselfish, heroic path of the Bodhisattva, as arhatship appears to be tainted with a residual selfishness, as it lacks the motivation of the great compassion or Mahakaruna. So I don't know that I would agree with this, because I cannot pretend to know what's going on in other people's minds, in the minds of arhats, you know, I mean, that I'm too stupid to know that. But anyway, I would summarize this particular paragraph as something like this: I suffer, you suffer, we all suffer, and I suffer with you, you know, as the bodhisattva, part of the bodhisattva path. But for an arhat, he might say something like, I suffer and I suffer alone, I awaken alone. So toodaloo. So now we get to the Wheel of Samsara, which is basically an explanation of how we get in so much trouble. And if we come back again to the heart of this diagram, we go and see these 3 animals. I'm trying to find my notes for, there's like, I think, repetition of certain things that I might have put in here in your handout. But anyway, the 3 animals in the middle, the rooster, the pig, and the snake are basically what constitutes our klesha or bonno. And this bonno starts this rotation. Oh, here it is. This bonno starts this rotation of the wheel that leads to these 6 realms of existence. And if you could see on the slide right next to it, it shows the 6 realms of existence. At the top one is heaven. The next one would be your gods or titans. You have the animal world. You have hell itself as asuras. You have hungry ghosts, and then you have the human world. And what we are taught is that the wheel of samsara is basically generated by this desire, right? Originates from the 3 animals of greed, anger, and ignorance. And because of desire, you know, we think about the Buddha's teachings of the Four Noble Truths, and the cause of our suffering essentially is desire. So this is another way of depicting what the Four Noble Truths might be like. So the wheel of becoming, or the Bhava Chakra, basically explains what can be done, or explains the Eightfold Path. Because if we look at what's outside the circle is the Buddha, which means that the Buddha was able to transcend this wheel of samsara. And now his purpose, basically his intention for appearing in the world, is to show us the way out of this samsara. And then it's maybe hard to see, but in each of these 6 realms of existence, there's a bodhisattva there. Which means that in any mental state that we go through, there is always the way out of this suffering. And then at the outer circle, you see the 12 links of causation or nidanas, which basically explains the details of patika samuppada, or dependent arising, which starts at the very top with a blind man that symbolizes ignorance. And that's something that, you know, is in a lot of text, so you could look that up if you'd like. Now the 3 animals in the middle, I call them my pets, generate 10 courses of unwholesome action. We talked about that earlier. The 3 bodily actions: taking life, taking what is not given, sexual misconduct. There's 4 verbal unwholesome actions: lying, divisive speech, hurtful speech, frivolous speech. And then 3 unwholesome mental actions: covetousness, ill will, and wrong view. And so when we talk about karma, there's the 3 karmic actions is basically what's explained here, the karmic actions of the body, the speech, and the mind. And so if we come back to the Amidharma Pitaka, it talks about really the antidotes to these poisons that are generated from bonno or klesha. And just as there are 10 unwholesome actions, there are 10 courses of unwholesome actions. And so for the bodily and the verbal unwholesome actions, the thing to do is refraining. In other words, you know, it brings back to mind another Buddhist word, which to me concurs very well with the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, and that is to do no harm. In other words, the refraining, or ahimsa, is a way of refraining from the 3 bodily and the 4 verbal unwholesome actions. So just stop, just don't do it. And then the 3 mental unwholesome actions of covetousness can be neutralized by the antidote of desirelessness. And I'm reminded of this saying somewhere in pop Buddhism: want less, suffer less. And then there's a sign in my office that says, let go or be dragged. There you go. And then another mental unwholesome action of ill will can be neutralized by kindness, and the wrong view is neutralized by right view. And so there are 10 wholesome actions of the body and the mind, really, and the mouth, if you will, that are further delineated out of these 10 courses of unwholesome and unwholesome actions. And they are charity, morality, mental discipline, reverence and respect, service to others, sharing merits with others, rejoicing in the merits of others, preaching and teaching the Dharma, listening to the Dharma, and straightening one's views. So now, to me, straightening one's views is really tricky, because to me, how it translates in the modern world is something that we call cognitive behavior therapy, you know, correct your stinking thinking. But But the 10 wholesome actions are basically the perfections and the practices of bodhisattvas. And so we can try to do some of this, but we're not going to be very good at all of it. Now, listening to the Dharma is also really interesting to me because of the implications in our daily lives as Jodo Shinshu, which is basically that's what we do, is we listen to the name of the Buddha, we recite the name of the Buddha, Namo Amida Butsu. And by saying we listen, by listening we say. Okay. So anyway, where does this lead us to? It leads us to this other Mahayana cosmological idea of Saha, or the place of suffering. And let's see if we can advance this now. Oh, okay. Okay. So let me just say something about the 5 skandhas, or the 5 aggregates. The skandhas are considered to be parts of a whole, or the aggregates of what makes a person. And those 5 parts are rupa form, which is body, basically. And the body has 5 senses, right? And so out of these 5 senses of hearing, the ears and the eyes and taste and smell and touch all bring about a consciousness called hearing consciousness and sound, sight consciousness. In other words, there's a sense organ, and then there's an object that sense organ is sensing, and then there's a consciousness that arises from that combination. And then there's Vedana, or sensations, which really, in my mind, more translates into mental, no, it translates into emotions, if you will. There's samjaya perceptions, which is what our thinking does when we interpret events with our minds. There's mental formations or cognition. Sorry, I'm kind of screwing this up. Sorry, I'm trying to see my entire slide. Oops, I can't do it. Okay. And then there's volition, and then there's consciousness. So what happens with the three animals in the middle is basically they comprise the heart of what we think being human is, meaning that there's a self, there's an I here, and out of this self comes these 5 skandhas, meaning that there can be no self if there are no 5 skandhas. And out of this self-attachment, if you will, come the source of suffering as a result of being attached to all these different parts of us. Okay, so in Mahayana, we understand that the nature of the aggregates is intrinsically empty of independent existence, which is where the philosophical treatise of Nagarjuna comes from, is shunyata, or emptiness. This is kind of tough. I'm sorry. All right. So anyway, let's put all this metaphysical stuff into perspective, called the Dharma Ages. Now that we've talked about the lifespan of the universe and the lifespan of human beings, sort of fall into this whole cosmological structure. Now we have the Dharma Ages that are basically based on the Buddha's existence. So in the first 500 years after the Buddha died, we have the right or true Dharma, because the Buddha's teachings are very much alive. And then 1,000 years after the Buddha's death, we only see a semblance of the right Dharma, because people are still reading scripture and they're still practicing the Dharma. And then the last stage, or Mappo, is basically 10,000 years after the Buddha's, lasts for 10,000 years after the Buddha's death. And some scholars would say it started in the year 1052. And so if we recall, you know, Shinran was born, and all these great masters really in Buddhist history in Japan, that's the time when Shinran was born, Dogen was born, Nichiren was born. They all started talking about teaching Buddhism, really in the context of this Mappo, like, holy cow, you know, we better be aware of our suffering now so that we can figure out a way to follow the Buddha's teachings and get ourselves, you know, in a better situation. And so one cosmological author, Akira Sakadata, basically says that, you know, the great teachers of the time emphasized the importance of religious practice as a way of achieving liberation from this world of suffering, or saha. And for Zen, the purpose is liberation, and the path is religious practice called zazen, or sitting meditation. In Pure Land, the purpose is salvation, and the path is recitation of Amitabha's name, Namo Amida Butsu. There are other paths in Buddhism, but Dogen and Zen would say the mind is everyday life, is in itself the path. And it makes me think of Chuang Tzu, because Buddhism is heavily influenced by Taoism. And I remember Chuang Tzu having written, saying that the path is made by walking on it. So we are on that path in this age of Mappo. But being on this life path means that rather than actively trying to escape this river of transmigration, we should trust ourselves into this flow. And to me, the word trust resonates very deeply with Jodo Shinshu. So anyway, where were we? Okay. Oops, where did my, okay. So we go into how the great philosophers Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu have affected really present-day mental health and our religious traditions in general. We know that Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu are the first two of the 7 masters of our tradition. I'm trying to find my notes here. Let's see. Oops. Sorry. Okay, so Nagarjuna was the first Pure Land master, really in the first, they call him the second Buddha, and he lived around the year 150 CE. And his whole thing is about the middle way. And it's written in his book called the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. And the middle way is, of course, the Buddha's teaching of the fourth of the Four Noble Truths. And the way that he phrased the middle way is from the lens of shunyata, or patika samupada. So shunyata means emptiness, but emptiness is not emptiness, and that there is nothing there. It's insubstantial in the sense that the way things are is the result of the way that things were. So it's based on the principle of dependent arising. And if we go back to the Wheel of Samsara, that's basically what the 12 links of causation talk about. And the middle way, or the Eightfold Path, points to shunyata itself, in the sense that shunyata is the completion of wisdom, which is talked about also in the Wisdom Sutras. So seeing things as they are, in a sense, is what shunyata is, but seeing things as they are means that the things are constantly flowing. And so we don't really see things as they are from our human eyes, but the reality itself is constantly changing. And in the sense that it's constantly changing, is unchanging. And so Nagarjuna talks about the two truths, the absolute and relative truth. And the absolute truth is, you know, incomprehensible, basically. We don't even bother to go there. The only truth that we could really know, and even that is depends on perception, is relative truth, meaning relative to a self. And so if the self is empty, shunyata, then truth basically is absolutely at that point. But because it cannot be comprehended, then there must be a self here that can only get a little bit of this relative truth. And that's basically the world that we live in. And that's why it's called Saha, or hell. All right. So anyway, out of this work comes Vasubandhu and his Yogacara philosophy. And Yogacara means mind only. And basically he says that there are, he talks mind only, meaning consciousness only. And this consciousness has 8 aspects, if you will. And because everything that is perceived by the mind is what we think reality is, a defiled mind basically distorts all reality. And that's what Vasubandhu talks about, meaning he's saying that samsara is mind only. So it's created by the mind. Our suffering is created by our own minds. The dharmas, or basic elements of reality, are perceptions. And these perceptions are skewed by our 6 consciousnesses, the 5 sense organs, right? Hearing, tasting, seeing, smelling, and seeing. And also the mind, which is considered to be the 6th sense, basically are the result of this defiled mind because of self-attachment. And then there's also an aspect of consciousness called alaya vijnana, which is storehouse consciousness, which is basically where it's the part of the mind that we sow seeds of our karmic actions. And the result of the seeds that we sow, depending on how they are cultivated or intentionally made conscious, arise into our consciousness that then can determine our actions that are still distorted by the self. And so no matter how we look at it, we're in be-do-do. Anyway, sorry, it's already been an hour, huh? Sorry. Okay, so we go into what this mind does, and this is basically what a defiled mind, in my mind, looks like, especially called fear. Fear seems to magnify experience itself, and so you remember these games, you know, that some kids would used to play, of shadows on the wall with their fingers, and you know, the shadows on the wall would look very different from what they actually come from. So fear is a distortion, but it is inherent in our biological structure to be fearful, because we think we have a self, and for as long as we are attached to ourselves, then we are fearful, as normal human beings, if there's such a thing as normal, of losing this self. And it comes back to the 8 sufferings of losing what we have, of losing what, of not having what we don't have, of dying, of getting old. I mean, all of these are basically manifestations of fear in Noble Truth number 1. And so we come to the cosmological representation that Jantao talks about Niga Byakudo, the white path between the two rivers, the river of fire and the river of water. And for a more detailed description of this, please consult your book, Collected Works of Shinran. Page 89 to 91 is a chapter on Shinjin, but basically it talks about the point of three deaths, where people on the path are cornered by beasts and bandits, and there's only one way to go, and this is the white path between the two rivers that we now know, of course, as Namo Amida Butsu or Nembutsu. But in our present day life, for me, it represents the crisis that we face, especially now in the age of COVID. And for me, this is really important to remember, because like what the old masters did, you know, Shinran, Dogen, Nietzsche, and all those, the importance of practice in their times was perhaps what got them through all those incredible difficulties that they suffered, all the trauma that they went through. And in my mind, that still holds true for today. So the fire represents anger, and the water represents greed. And in our tradition, as Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, we are shown this Nembutsu way, the white path, because we don't know any better. We don't have any place else to go. And a lot of my patients feel really trapped in this situation because they feel like they have no way to go. And in my mind, gee, I wish, you know, they would read Shinran's book, or we could talk about Shinshu. Oh, here he is. But, you know, I try not to proselytize in my practice. I just kind of keep it in the back of my head. And so I think about Shinran, I think about Shinran as a way of getting myself centered. Okay, I can't see my whole slide here. Oh, oops. So how do I get this bar over? Oh, here it is. Sorry. So Shinran says, this then is the true teaching, easy to practice for small, foolish beings. I'm just going to go into my book. That is in the Collected Works preface, page 3. This then is the true teaching, easy to practice for small, foolish beings. It is the straight way, easy to traverse for the dull and ignorant. Among all the teachings of the great sage preached in his lifetime, none surpasses this ocean of virtues. Let the one who seeks to abandon the defiled and aspire for the pure, who is confused in practice and vacillating in faith, whose mind is dark and whose understanding deficient, whose evils are heavy and whose karmic abstractions manifold, let such persons embrace above all the Tathagata's exhortations, take refuge without fail in the most excellent direct path, devote themselves solely to this practice, and revere only this Shinjin. So in my mind, this speaks to the importance of Buddhist practice, especially in this present day of COVID and Mappo. What happens now is when we look at the news and we see all the opinions that are being thrown around, some of them are really irritating. And I do think stupidity should be painful, but it's not. And this makes me think of the difficulty of Jodo Shinshu doctrine, and basically it points to how, you know, I am so stupid to see my own stupidity, that when I judge other people as stupid, I think it's that they are stupid, but it's really my own stupidity that makes me think they are stupid. So I go to Yoda, when Yoda would say, piss me off, you have. That's kind of what happens to me when I watch too much of the news. And then he would say, you have to unlearn what you have learned. And in this age of quarantine and social distancing, it gives ample opportunity to reflect on this evil mind that I have, that Shinran also talks about. So in that sense, our fear basically shatters our sense of who we are. So we are like these pieces of pottery that in Japan they call kintsugi, where broken pieces of this pottery can be put together with liquid gold, which makes me think about how healing happens from a religious Jodo Shinju perspective, with the goal being the Nembutsu, the salvific power of Amida's vow, to put all of our broken pieces together so that we emerge, out of this journey looking so much more beautiful and more profound and really more reassembled in a much better way. So I'm hoping that what we're all going through will make us better versions of ourselves. And, some people experience Mappo as like a Buddhist hell, and, being tortured in this big vat. We see all these devils torturing people in this hot hell. And it makes me think of one of our traditions, Mochitsuki, where, you can have the best mochi only if you're pounded like into smithereens by all of these hammers. So in a sense, there's a purification process that's going through right now. And of course, quarantine can bring about isolation and loneliness. This is our little dog Miso looking out the window, seeing what it might be like to rejoin it. And I think we all kind of raise these questions too with ourselves. What's it gonna be like when this whole thing is over? But in the meantime, we have to contend with this self-attachment that we all have that just essentially intensifies this anxiety and this fear. So we have to think about our minds as, again, the sixth organ that consumes things. Our ears consume sounds, our eyes consume images, right? Our nose consumes smells, and in the same manner, our mind consumes things. And so this cartoon says, what can we do to stop living in fear? And this guy just turns off the TV. And I could definitely relate to that. I mean, I haven't been listening to the news now for a couple of weeks, and it's so refreshing. Okay, and then we have to be reminded that there's a bodhisattva in hell. And so no matter how hellish it is, if we come back to the Buddhist teachings, and then the 6 realms of existence, there's a bodhisattva in there. And the idea here is to find these bodhisattvas in our own lives. Then there's the idea of hakurai, okay, manipulation. Our egos will try to manipulate whatever we could in order to get out of this suffering. But there is a boundary between what we can control and what we cannot control. So this is an example of how to limit our hakurai in the boundaries of our own limited self-power, meaning what I can control and what I cannot control. So I could do my homework, I can respect property, I can be kind. I mean, if we go back to the 10 wholesome actions, they're all in there. And of course, outside of that, like death or who loves me or my past mistakes, it's all gone. I have no control over that. And so part of this is really relinquishing this hakurai, this egoic manipulation of trying to control everything. And in so doing, we could be liberated to some degree from our own self-attachment. And of course, in Shinshu, we think about humility. This is the wisteria growing right outside the Salt Lake Buddhist Temple. And we know that the wisteria, or Sagari Fuji, right, symbolizes humility because this particular flower bows when it's in full bloom. And out of that humility can come gratitude. So this is one really helpful exercise that some of my patients have taken into, is just having some sort of a gratitude journal. One of my patients does not like writing journals. So what she's done is she has a gratitude box. And every time she thinks of something that she's grateful for, she just writes writes a word or a phrase on a little piece of paper and sticks it in her box. And she says that when she's depressed, she just takes out her box and goes through all her cool little things that she actually has that makes her happier. And then, of course, for Shinshu, right, gratitude is the surest path through a dark forest. When we look at ourselves and the darkness of our own ignorance, and we only see darkness there, in Namo Amida Butsu, inherent in saying and hearing Namo Amida Butsu is this expression of gratitude that can shed some light, a little bit of light in this darkness that we're all suffering. In my mind, when we're looking at darkness and we see this incredibly dark shadow, the only way that we could see this dark shadow is because the light has our backs. So when we turn our backs to the light, it does not mean the light has abandoned us. It just means that our shadows get darker. And the only way the shadow can exist is because of the light. Okay, so in this age of Mappo, we can catastrophize, and there's some kind of an apocalyptic flavor, I suppose, in this age. And so this is a funny cartoon. I hope that Tanaka-sensei doesn't mind, because I kind of stole it from his Facebook page. But anyway, this monk, this Christian monk, I guess, is saying Jesus is coming. And then this Buddhist monk is saying Buddha here now. And I am reminded of this poem that Reverend David Matsumoto talked about in one of his Dharma talks. And the poem goes, today's today, yesterday is today, and tomorrow is today, which makes me think about the timelessness, really, of the Dharma. And of course, the timelessness of Amida Buddha. Okay. Oh, I guess that ends my presentation. How about that? Sorry, that was so long. I really, really apologize. So hopefully this all kind of makes sense to you. What do I do now?
Okay, so let's stop your screen sharing.
Oh, okay.
And then we can put it on everyone. So if anyone wants to put their picture up, I think this was the time we were going to have questions from people.
Yeah.
If someone wanted to ask Carmella a question, they can unmute themselves and ask you something. But that was a very nice presentation, Carmella.
Oh, thank you.
First, I thought it was going to be way above me, which it was anyway. But still, I got a lot out of it, though. It really was great.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
okay.
Anyone that would like to ask Carmella a question?
So I was telling Judy earlier that I'm really no good at giving lectures. In fact, I hate lectures because it just shows me how much I don't know. But I prefer more of this interactive format. So, this is a good time for you all to raise controversial issues, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
Landon.
Yeah, Landon.
Hi, Sensei. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for your lecture today. It was a little bit above my head too, and I know that I shouldn't say that as an IBS student. The Abhidharma has escaped me for I can't get it together. But it did help. I think I have a little bit better understanding, having been a couple years since I took the classes with this. And I wanted to ask you a question specifically because of your background. I've been told at IBS, in Buddhist Cosmology, most of my professors that I've talked to say that there's no place that our religious overall system holds for free will. And I know that some Jodo Shinshu Buddhists, even ministers, do believe that there is free will, and whether that's right or wrong, that's fine. I know people have their own personal takes on how to view the world, but I wanted to know what your thoughts were on free will, and also if I was going to use the argument that it wasn't, should I be looking into the Yogacara as well as dependent co-arising and stuff like that, and maybe no self, just for my thesis. And if you could maybe give a layman's terms, because I'm a little bit lower on the educational system than you.
No, I totally disagree. I mean, I have to admit, this really just blew my mind. Every time I go into this cosmologic stuff, I mean, it just blows my mind. It just kind of shows me, it's like, oh my gosh, I can't grasp this. But the part that's really fascinating to me, and especially your question of free will, to me, that kind of brings out two issues. One is, again, what they talked about with intentionality, right? And intentionality implies that we have a choice. And in fact, we had this argument in one of our adult study classes, that we have a choice. And I guess my response to that is we do and we don't. We do in the sense that from a relative truth perspective, there is a self here, you know, that has preferences, of course. And out of these preferences comes choice. So I prefer not to do the laundry today, which means, you know, I get to choose to do something else, which might be to do nothing. But then in the same manner, we don't really have a choice, meaning we don't have free will in the sense that we are still living in this karmic macrocosm and macrocosm where the choices that we make, that we think we make, are limited to what is being presented to us. You know what I mean? Meaning what the circumstances that are being presented to us are really not in our control. They're just here. And they're here as they are as a result of pratitya samutpada, dependent arising. And so these things are brought about that are completely out of our hakarai, completely out of our consciousness, but here they are. So it raises the question, now what? Which brings us back into choosing our response. Yeah. So for me, it's both. It's neither, okay?
So just to maybe ask a little bit more clarification, and that makes a lot of sense, thank you. If I was going to be talking about this, because I might talk about it in my presentation next weekend, but for sure in my thesis work. So if I was going to reference it, I would want to make sure that I would have mentioned that, and then dependent co-arising, if you were explaining it to maybe a layperson, when I need to give the extra info then, that just to make sure they understand that karma or dependent co-arising isn't fatalistic, that it's out of control and it's just like a random kind of hodgepodge of things just kind of firing at you. Would that be a layman's terms?
Okay, so fatalism to me is like a variant of pessimism, right? Kind of sort of like a doomsday type of thinking. And you know, in a sense that's true, and in a sense that's not necessarily true, because truth itself is multidimensional, like all existence is multidimensional. And so from the perspective of pratitya samutpada, you know, this is this because that is that. In other words, there's only a top because there's a bottom. There's only a right side because there's a left side. And to me, you know, when you get into this idea of non-duality that pretty much explains everything, now we're getting into this realm of absolute reality, which is difficult to comprehend. So there, from our Jodo Shinshu tradition basically points to our own subjectivity, and that is when we study material Buddhist teachings, you know, ultimately we have to come back to our own subjective experience and understanding of what the Dharma is telling us to do, or how we understand the Dharma. So ultimately we come back to a mundane relative self that's fully attached, you know, to our bonno, to our klesha. But that's speaking really more personally, religiously, if you will, which is a totally different conversation than the academic conversations that you might have when you're trying to defend your thesis. You know what I mean? So I don't know. The bottom line is I have no idea what you're gonna do or you're supposed to do.
No, thank you, Sensei. That actually really clarifies a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, Sensei?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who am I talking to?
George Thau. Yeah, I just unmuted myself.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
trying to see your picture.
Oh.
Oh, here we go.
Oh, okay. Okay,
I
good.
see a name, but I don't see a person.
Oh, well, believe me, there's a person there.
All right.
Anyway, well, I just wanted to make an observation. I was reading your handout
Yeah.
and was impressed with the fact that I was pretty familiar, actually, with a lot of what you were talking about because of my study of a book, The Essentials of Buddhist Philosophy by um, Takakusu Junjiro. That was first published in Hawaii in the 1950s, and that was the first material like this that I ever really studied. And he very arbitrarily said, okay, normally the first course in study is to study Madhyamaka. But he said, he said, you should really have to study what actually came to China first, and that was Yogacara. So I have been very grateful to him ever since for his being so arbitrary. Well, I was just wondering, have you done any study of his work at all? Have you read that?
No, and I'm glad you mentioned him. I was trying to find my pen so I could write it down. What was his name again?
Okay, let me be sure I give it to you correctly.
I have it in my library. You don't need to.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Okay. Yeah. Well, written in the Japanese fashion is Takakusu. That's last name. Junjiro.
Junjiro.
Yeah.
And the name of his book is what?
The Essentials of Buddhist Philosophy.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
No, I'm sad to say I haven't, but I'm definitely going to look it up. Thank you so much. But Yogacara is fascinating, though, because, well, especially for my profession, you know, the work that we do really every day when I meet with a patient is to really, we look at their minds. We both of us look at their minds, at the content of their minds. And really, in a sense, I'm sharing the content of my mind. And so it's basically just two delusional people talking to each other, you know, but that's okay because delusion involves suffering and suffering always loves company, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what makes my work interesting. And I think that ultimately, if people can have just some understanding about their own minds, and of course the mind can go anywhere, I mean, it's boundless by itself, then there's so much more probability really of what people can do with what it is that they're stuck on. The cognitive neuroscientists actually have an interesting term called cognitive flexibility, which in my mind is really how you would define the bodhisattva, the mind of the pliant mind of the bodhisattva. And so this cognitive flexibility is basically just a quality of mind that can see things or tries to see things from different angles, right? As opposed to being stuck with one view. And of course, being stuck in one view is wrong view because, you know, there is no one right view. Everything's opinion. But anyway, yeah, Yogacara is fascinating.
Yeah. Well, anyway, well, I want to express my appreciation also about something else. You mentioned some experiences you've had, obviously, as a therapist. Now, I am not a trained therapist. I enter into this very, very reluctantly, but we had a member at our temple who I got to know very well. He, like me, was a Vietnam War veteran. I'll make this very short, but if you've never heard of this, don't worry about it too much. Anyway, he was involved with the Phoenix program. Basically, he was managing terroristic activity from our side. And what I picked up on him very, very quickly was that he was horribly burdened by this. And his whole direction in trying to be a Buddhist seemed to be to generate roots of merit to wash away all that junk. So, but then his health began to collapse, and finally I had a chance to sit down and talk with him. And basically, the only thing I could say to him was, don't worry about it. All that stuff is the content of your enlightenment. And I could see there was a light that went on in his eyes. But there was a personal motivation for me too, because I wasn't involved in any junk like that, but I saw the hind end of the elephant, so to speak, because I was there at the Vietnam toward the end of the war. And I feel an obligation to anyone who is in a situation like that to try and give them a direction, a way out of hell. And for me, I was very grateful that I had this opportunity, that he basically allowed this to happen, because just a few weeks later he died. He was terminal with cancer.
Wow.
Yeah. So I guess the only thing I mean to say right now is that I was very conscious of his situation. I was very conscious of how little time was left. So basically, I just had to talk to him very directly and give him what I figured he needed. And I think
what you're saying there, really what you're saying there is you also feel his suffering, which to me is a very Mahayana way of, walking this path.
Yeah. Well,
and that's probably one of the most difficult things to do when you're listening to somebody's trauma, is that you carry that suffering with you as well, and you take it with you wherever you go. And so we have to be able to rely on something, right, to help us carry this weight, this burden of trauma. And to me, that's Nembutsu.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a comment more than a question. In Western psychology, there's the biopsychosocial model of disease.
Yeah.
Trying to reconcile nature and nurture, saying that the structures in your brain are inherited by your parents, but whether those traits show up as positive or negative has to do more with your life experience. And I just found that like totally fits in with when you were comparing Nagarjuna and Vasubandhu, that like dependent origination is the structures in your brain, those are from your parents. Your brain is a mixture of your father and your mother, so you're going to have traits from your father and your mother. But like with Vasubandhu, about how nirvana and samsara are interlinked, it's how you're going to be as a person. Your personality has more to do with your life experiences and your choices. You have to deal with annoying people to learn patience, like.
But I would want to qualify that, okay? Because I think what determines how we experience life itself also depends on perception, the lens that we put on.
Right.
And the work of reckoning really with the ego, in my mind, is reckoning with the way we perceive reality itself. And of course, it's going to be delusional no matter what. But at least we can take some responsibility for how we perceive things. Because ultimately, it's only our perception that defines what that reality is. So if we say somebody is stupid, right, we're putting on the lens of stupid, and everything that we see is stupid. But if we put on another lens, suffering being, the world can look totally different, but it's still the same thing. Reality hasn't really changed. But the way we view reality is, I think, what makes the difference between, quote, wholesome and unwholesome mental states. So I guess what I'm saying is, we can, now based on Landon's paradox, right, we have a choice to put on the wholesome lens, right, or the unwholesome lens. But a lot of that has to do with determining first what lens we're wearing in the first place.
It's all about like the power of introspection. You have to actually recognize these things in yourself to make that choice to be better.
Yeah, and to me, that's why to me this quarantine is a great opportunity, right? To look at ourselves. They might call it quarantine, but really from a Buddhist, Zen Buddhist perspective also, it's a retreat.
Sensei, who was it that you quoted that said the path is made by walking on it?
Oh, it's Chuang-Tzu. Chuang. He's and he's the student of Lao Tzu. And Lao Tzu is kind of more of a more formal, academic, kind of serious guy, and Chuang-Tzu is kind of more of a cut up, from what I understand. But I really like his book called Inner Chapters.
Okay.
Inner Chapters. And he was the same guy who said, what if I was really a butterfly? He was dreaming about this butterfly, right? And he was saying, what if I was really a butterfly dreaming I was Chuang-Tzu? You know, his mind kind of works that way. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
There's a Bill Ames.
I'm Diane Ames. It says I cannot start my video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, okay.
You can start again by just hitting start again.
Hit start my video again.
Yes, where it says, yeah, there you go. You're up.
There you go.
Oh,
okay.
okay.
Hello.
Hi.
Well, my question is, I have to. My doctor says I have to go to a testing lab to get a blood test on Tuesday, and after that I'll have to go to a hospital to get a CT scan, and I find this frightening. Going to a hospital, particularly on account of the COVID-19. How do I deal with this?
I think it's important for you to bring your anxiety and fear with you, because anxiety and fear have a purpose. They also defend our ego in some way. And so in your case, when you're afraid, that could maybe help you to be more cautious and to be more aware of how you're going to protect yourself. So it can be a very useful tool.
Well, that's the evolutionary purpose of fear, I think, to tell you when to watch out. And
yes, it's self-preservation. Yeah, absolutely. Again, it comes from our self-attachment, right? But you know, it's attachment to life itself, to our life, and I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes. Well, I'm 74 years old and I have asthma, so it
is scary, but there's nothing wrong with being scared.
Yes.
But if that's something you need to do, then it needs to be done, right? There's a certain fearlessness on the other side of this fear, and that is we feel the fear, but by doing something purposely for a certain goal, that requires fearlessness too. So really, in that sense, you're both fearful and fearless.
Well, I'll take some hand sanitizer with me.
And your mask and everything.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing that, yeah.
John Hughes here, Sensei. Thank you for the presentation. I have a friend who's very educated in a variety of religious traditions. He's got a PhD from Oxford in religious history and studies all kinds of stuff. He makes the point that Nikon is specifically very well suited for Jodo Shinshu philosophy, and I'd like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Yeah, Nikon is actually a very Jodo Shinshu practice, because it was started by this devout Jodo Shinshu Buddhist by the name of Isshin Yoshimoto. And Isshin used a business model to devise a user-friendly way of cultivating gratitude, humility and gratitude. So Nai means inner and Kan is looking from what I understand, but it's looking deeply into the self and the nature of the self in relationship with others. And so in Shinshu, it's looking at the relationship between Bombu and Amida Buddha. And in order to understand more the details and the depth, the nature of this relationship between Bombu self and Amida Buddha, we respond to 3 questions. What have I received? What have I given? What troubles and difficulties have I caused? So it's looking at grace, Amida's grace. What have I received? Meaning what benefits have I received from others, if you can say others as manifestations of great compassion itself, i.e. Amida, right? What have I received from others? And then the second question, what have I given? It looks at our own capacity to translate this generosity in our own hearts. And in Shinshu, we talked about Eshin, the turning of the heart, right? So looking at what we are able to give looks at our own capacity to be kind and compassionate also, which, in that way, it fosters positive mental health or good mental health. And then the question, what troubles and difficulties have I caused, is really more, I think, the repentance that Shinran talks about. How have I caused more suffering for other people? And then to me, it kind of relates to this idea of ahimsa, right? Or self-restraint. Now that I know how much trouble I've caused people, what can I do to not do it again? Kind of thing. So it kind of helps to lessen the suffering all around. But Nikon does not look at what troubles and difficulties have other people caused me. That's what politicians do. It's fault finding, right? That's not Nikon anymore. And it just makes us more crazy. So if we just focus on the 3 questions, it centers our minds into how we can contribute in a positive and healthy manner to any relationship that we enter into, whether it's with other people or even with our own minds.
Thank you, Sensei. I appreciate that answer.
Thank you.
Are there any other? Oh,
Hi, Carmella. This is Irene.
Irene, hi.
Hi. Relating to what John just asked you, I'm looking for examples of actual advice that you might give your patients. Do you recommend to them, or do you go through them, Nikon with them?
It depends, really. The therapy process is really quite fluid. And what I've learned after, 35 some years of practice is that I don't have an agenda anymore. I just go in there, open the chart, and go, well, what's going on, And then we go from there. And so if people come in and they are complaining about their spouses, right, or their children or whatever, that might be a great opportunity to go into Nikon. So, your husband is a bore, he's a grump or whatever. But what happened yesterday that he might have done for you that made your life a little easier? Oh, well, he took out the garbage, that sort of thing. So Nikon can be very, very ordinary, but that's really the only thing we can grasp is ordinary reality. We have no idea what esoteric or absolute reality is. So Nikon is really very down to earth, which is so Shinshu also in my mind. And again, it's that practice of gratitude, right?
I've been finding that this quarantine time, since I have a lot of time, finding my practice of going before my Obutsudan more regular, and it's becoming more gratifying. I can take time to take care of my flower before the shrine. I'm more regular at putting up obupan. I actually think about it when I'm preparing food. So I'm grateful for this time to be isolated. So
yeah, that's a very interesting thing that you just brought up there, Irene, because in essence, you're answering your own question, Nikon number 2, right? What have I given? But also, I think it points to how our minds can be liberated if we're not quite so self-absorbed. And so if we pay attention to the world around us, and this is where the sensory-based meditations might be helpful, okay, is to look at the world around us, because once our sense organs have the sense consciousness that there's an object there of our attention, then our self-preoccupation basically is turned away from the self-attachment to non-self. And just by doing that is such a relief. That's why I think people really feel better when they're gardening or they have a hobby, you know, or they're reading something, because it turns our attention away from this darkness of the ego into the world around us that really ultimately takes care of us in some way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Yes.
Hi, Carmella.
Who am I talking to?
This is Joe, also from Seattle, one of Irene's friends.
Oh, yeah, Joe. Yeah.
You.
Good to see you.
Sensei, let me ask you to help Dharma parents and grandparents think about the implications of this pandemic and the stay at home and the no school and the 18-year-old who all of a sudden, you know, the college entrance may be put on hold. What advice would you give to parents and grandparents and friends to help young people deal with the fear and anxiety of the unknown at this point in time?
So a lot of times young brains, if you will, cannot process logic and reason, and that's just part of brain immaturity. So in early adolescence, from puberty, age 10, 9, right, all the way into maybe even the mid-20s, we think of a developmental model of understanding how the brain works, and it's predominantly just emotional. There is a core in the brain called the limbic system, which basically produces emotions, if you will, okay? And there's a button there, an alarm button called the amygdala. And then when that starts freaking out because there's something to be afraid of, then it just kind of shoots all of these neuronal connections into the cortex. And that's what people are conscious about, is just all this fear and anxiety and everything. But because adolescents have, quote, immature brains, and they don't reach the stage of maturity where the cortex, the thinking logical brain, is not fully developed until maybe the second half of the 20s, okay? There's gonna be a lot of emotion there, and there's just not a lot of logic. So one way to approach somebody who's fearful is to just sit with them and just listen to all these emotions coming out, all this moaning and groaning and complaining and all of that. This comes from a developmental model that some of these early pioneers talk about. I think it's Carl Whitaker. But anyway, they were basically saying that the role of a parent is kind of like a basket. It's like a burden basket that just kind of gets dumped on by all of these emotions that are hemorrhaging out of these kids' brains. And that might be one of the most helpful things that parents can do, is to just get dumped on, if you will, and try not to be judgmental. I hear you. I see you're really, you know, freaking out about this, and yeah, and that's understandable. You know, I mean, they can't process advice quite yet. So the advice in this case is really more for parents to be able to just try to contain their children's anxieties as well as their own. In my office, I have this little Indian basket hanging on my doorknob, and the American Indians call it the burden basket. And it's just a little basket with like little things hanging down from it. And one of my patients said, "What is this?" And I said, "That's a burden basket, and you're supposed to leave all your burdens here before you leave the door." And she goes, "You better get a huge basket." my burdens are not going to fit all in there. But it's kind of like that, because when somebody is emoting really intensely, there's really not much you could do to process anything.
Thank you.
Carmella?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I'm with the Midwest Buddhist Temple, Chicago.
Oh, hi.
Hi, how are
Jesse.
you?
Yeah, good.
I
See you.
enjoy your talks all the time. I like the way you translate some difficult concepts into really just everyday words.
Thank you.
I remember you talking about relationships and how people are stuck inside their brain, and we've seen that with dealing with homeless people, and a way to get them out of their brain. Sometimes we do some chair yoga, and that brings them back, or tries to bring them out, which sometimes it's very difficult. My question though is, with people who deal, who have anger management problems, that they deal with anger in every situation, and that's how they solve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And I see it like on TV now, all these competition shows where all these, wrestling or whatever it is, these guys, just deal with everything with anger. And I think it's, it's people are connecting with that, like to solve problems, everything that is done with anger. What do you do with, and I know people, personally that have anger management problems. They deal with every problem, trying to solve it with anger.
Mm-hmm.
Where does it come from, and how can you reason with somebody who just it just gets angry at everything?
You can't. It's like trying to reason with a drunk. But let's put anger in perspective, though, because anger is a very, very strong emotion. And it basically has a purpose, and that purpose is to defend the ego from crumbling. So it's kind of like an armor that people put on, but it's not just an armor that protects the psyche from things coming in, but it's got weapons attached to it. So it's an assault as well as protection. And there's a certain toxic energy about anger. And the thing is that if we look at it from the lens of dukkha, anger is very painful. And because when people cannot carry the pain of their own anger, they tend to dump it on other people. It's like, here, take some of my crap, so that I won't have to feel quite as burdened by it. So if you look at it from the lens of suffering, anger is one of the most painful things to keep in our minds. And a lot of times people cannot tolerate the intensity of their own anger, and that's how they try to project it onto other people. And what we could do if we become the objects of those anger, right, is ahimsa, right, restraint, meaning that we can feed their anger by being angry back at them, or we can just let it drop. And because anger, anger, the Buddha likens anger to like this fire, right? And the more you feed the fire, the more fuel you give the fire, the more it continues. And therefore it follows, if you don't feed it, eventually it's just going to extinguish itself out. So if somebody's angry, you don't need to be around that. You can set some boundaries.
Right, thank you. No, I ignore them. You're right. Not much you can do. Thank you.
Nope, not really. Except not be around it. So it's 1:49.
Yeah, you've been talking nonstop for,
Right. No, right?
I know
don't
you
know
like
if
to
I
talk,
need
but
to
never that long, huh, Carmella?
I know, right? Thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you all for putting up with all this prattle.
No, it was very good. It made me think, yes, I need to go back and think about the teachings of the Buddha to help me get through things. Because even like Diane, I had to take blood, and I was so paranoid. I'm going to have to go in there. I have not left my house in 9 weeks. What am I going to do? But it's true. You just have to sort of take it with you and figure out how you're going to help yourself. So
arm yourself with your paranoia to the hilt, Judy.
Yeah. But I think for me, it helped me to sort of relax and calm and understand and be grateful, like you said, for what we have. If you think about it, sometimes we get so caught up in the other things and what we can't do. Be grateful for what you can do. That's my feeling. Yeah. I don't know if anyone else has Any comments for her before we end?
So there's just one thing that maybe is like a takeaway from, especially from the words of Shinran, right?
Mm-hmm.
And basically he says, and I included sort of all of these verses from the Shosomatsu Wasan in the collected works in your handout, right? And basically one of them says, and that's what I'm saying, take your delusion and your fear and your anxiety with you wherever you go, because it could be very helpful. But he says here on verse 22, when the waters of the mind, entrusting to other power, enter the ocean waters of Amida's vow of wisdom, then in accord with the nature of the true and real fulfilled land, blind passions and enlightenment come to be of one taste. So our delusion is the same as the Buddha's enlightenment. Our fear is the same as the Buddha's fearless compassion. There is no separation. And to me, this is at the heart of the Nembutsu, Namo Amida Butsu. It's Kiho Itai, the inseparability of Bunbu and Buddha. The inseparability of fear and fearlessness. Yes? So with that, we can end. Is that good?
Yeah, Reverend Hirano, did you want to thank Carmella?
Yes, thank you, Carmella.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone, for joining